Hello and welcome to a new year of the Self-Made Podcast. It's really hard to believe that we're coming to our second year of the Self-Made Podcast. Started in March 2021 and moving into 2022, we are starting off with a bang with Coach Kassem from N1 Education. For those of you who don't know Cass, he provides phenomenal courses and educational content for personal trainers on how to better their craft. What he says at the end of the episode really hits home and resonates with me, that the joy of seeing people get further in the career earlier than he did, and he has done that on a grand scale with so many people. This guy is a massive figure in the industry, and we talk a number of things here, from how he became an air quotes an overnight success, where that actually was 20 years of hard work in the making, how he became an expert in his field, and his personal and professional development tips. Before going into training, how do we program specifically for you? What things do you need to be aware of when you're looking at programming to maximize your recovery, your health, and your physique? We then segue into integrity in the industry and talking about the current landscape of social media and the importance of debate in a world where debate is becoming less and less common. There's a lot of things covered in this episode. Cass is an absolute wealth of knowledge, and I'm very, very honored to have him on. So I'll leave you with myself and Kassem Hanson. So, Kassem, I've been very excited to get you onto the show. Firstly, because I think, your courses really have had a big impact on the way I look at my career, both on and off the gym floor, on both your in-person online courses. But for people who may not know you or may not know a little bit of your backstory, it almost appears that you've appeared on the scene overnight with this really strong brand that people know well. But as we both know, there's no such thing as an overnight success. And I know there was 20 years behind you. So tell us a little bit about who you are, who you became, who you are.
Well, so what I am right now basically is an educator, mostly for trainers, and we'll say the more thoughtful of those of the fitness industry, the people that care about the nuances, so to speak. But I think a big reason why it seems like I've come onto the scenes late is that in the majority of my career, I've preferred to be behind the scenes. Right. So when I was working with IFBB pros, when I was Olympians, Olympic athletes, whatever, we'll put it this way, I tried to be as humble as possible during those years of my life. And I really tried to make everything about the athletes that I was working with. And I also got into the role of what we'll say is kind of a fixer, meaning that through through the years of education, I was a big fan with Charles Poliquin, which, you're very familiar with, whatever. And Charles and Bob Rakowski both turned me down the functional medicine route. And that basically just started me getting in the weeds and taking every outside of university education thing that I could have. Like for a while, I was probably traveling at least one weekend a month for a 2-year period, to take course. I tallied it somewhere at about $160K that I spent over the course of those 2 years, right? US dollars on continuing education, because once I got the taste for it, I just wanted it as fast as I could. But while I was going through that process, I didn't feel like I should be, very vocal, and obviously social media wasn't what it was. But I think once I stepped out of that light, I had enough support from all of the people that I had worked with. I had enough clout in kind of some of the who's of people, even if, they aren't super public about it, that it allowed us to quickly transition to being a success on our own, if that makes sense. Right. So the transition from basically, I think prior to 2017, I didn't really use social media for business at all. It was the rare, odd, thing or whatever. Right. So we're definitely behind on that. But coming on after that, especially because I know the prime time to grow was 2015 to 2017. And I managed to just perfectly land on the backside slope of that. Like right when Facebook decided, hey, we're no longer going to share any of your stuff with anybody unless you pay us. That's when we decided to start, working on that stuff. But I think, the things that really propelled us were, having put all of that work in with a lot of really important, really credible people in the industry. And then having that foundation where once I did decide to come out and start speaking, it wasn't oh, hey, here's this guy that's just starting in the industry. I was able to talk like I'd been in the industry forever because I had been in the industry forever. I just, to me personally, I still wish my role was behind the scenes, like I love getting in, I love getting in front of students and teaching them. But in terms of, being on social media and the marketing aspects, those are definitely my least favorite aspects of the business. Necessary, but least favorite.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel at all like it was mentally daunting at first, coming from being like in gyms, like in my 40, being the head of education, but being within a big brand? Like, I mean, I'm coming at the industry in a slightly different angle to you these days, and maybe help training, going directly for coaches helps. But I was very similar in running education for a global brand. The brand was what was known. I wasn't what was known. And then coming out to that was almost a little bit, I wouldn't say imposter syndrome because I knew my worth, but it was a very daunting thing. It was like, now no one knows who I am. I've got to almost prove a point. I mean, was it similar for you, or did you have enough connection and goodwill built up that it was quite seamless?
I would say it was quite seamless, partly because of the connections, and also because, MI40 was a bit of a farce. I mean, if you know the history of when theirs is like, we'll say the brand and what was going on there didn't live up to the expectations. And so basically anybody that knew enough, which basically was everybody that had invested money in there, knew who the real brains and who the thought, leaders were in there, and who the people doing the actual work were. So when we stepped out, basically all of those people followed us, right? Yeah. And that was basically all of the people that were highly invested. So to the casual person that just followed, those people on social media, they might not have known the real story. And so they might not have realized who we were, or how much of the work that we're doing, but pretty much everybody that had invested knew. So we were able to build our credibility within that, because if you came to a camp during the MI40 days, like I led that camp, I taught that camp, so that authority was already there. Like the online coaching and stuff that we did, and a lot of the programs and whatever, like a lot of that was, was my work, and some of it was Cody's work and stuff. So when we moved on, it was very easy for those people to be like, okay, I see where the minds are going, and so I'm going to follow them, right? And I mean, if you followed that, like one thing has stayed the same, and some things have changed a lot over the course of those 4 years.
Yeah, I think you see it. It's very common. You tend to see trends, and I think I often see trends in these big fitness brands where a lot of them have a boom period when they have a number of guys in the right place at the right time, and as businesses grow and scale, it almost becomes that if you ever heard the E-Myth, the E-Myth sums this up perfectly for me in that it's like, right, we'll create a system of working, and then we'll teach somebody brand new to do that system, and then it all often gets watered down, and that's when you start to see other brands coming with the level of integrity that N1 has, and various other people coming out of the muscle mentors and from other gyms and things like that. So going into learning to be an expert, one of the things I was really fascinated about getting you on as well as talking about training was that your level of knowledge is outstanding. I think no one can question that. What are your sort of professional development tips? How have you become the expert that you are today in terms of training, nutrition, everything else?
Well, let me start by saying, I don't think you can learn to become an expert. I think what you do is you just never stop learning. And then eventually, if you grind away at that enough, maybe then your peers will start to view you as an expert. But you can't just be like, I want to be an expert. What are the things that I have to do? Because to be a real expert, you have to understand that the target will always be moving, right? To be an expert means that you have to be following the innovations of the field. So it's a never ending pursuit, right? You might, from a business perspective, you might be able to reach a certain level where it's just okay, at a particular moment in time, I could maybe be considered an expert or really knowledgeable on a specific thing. But if you haven't got there with the habit of this is just going to be an ongoing thing, that's when you quickly create your own glass ceiling. And I see that happen to people all of the time where they think, okay, I just need to get to where XYZ person is, but that person is, 6 years, 10 years, 20 years ahead of you. And then by the time they get there, that's no longer the place to be. That's no longer what an expert is. And so I don't think that you can decide hey, I just want to, accomplish XYZ things. I want to get a degree or whatever. I think the thing that has really helped me is just my obsession with wanting to continue to learn, even at this stage in my career. And the thing is, it becomes more and more challenging because eventually you run out of classes to take, you run out of courses to take. You start looking at the research and be like, okay, like, is anybody going to do, like, how many interesting papers are going to come out this year after you've read so many of the papers, especially how many papers are going to come out that are actually going to change or add something instead of just, kind of reaffirming what we're already doing, et cetera. And so you just have to continually scale your efforts to get better, the better you get. Right. I mean, it's like any skill as you would move up in levels of sport. Right. If you start at, in grade school and you're just playing with, the people that are close to you. Right. But then if you exceed on to university or whatever, now you're playing with people that were successful in their local regions. And then to be a pro, now you're playing with the top of those. And then if you want to be like, a Hall of Fame all-timer or whatnot, it's just like, all right, it takes a lot more work because at that point in time, the playing field is now higher. You have to do different things to, separate yourself or, get better. And, if you're competing with yourself, you're basically always chasing your own heels, right? So it's just like, how do I beat the guy from yesterday, right? And if I do beat that guy, that means the guy the guy that I have to go against tomorrow is going to be an even harder challenge to beat.
I always think exactly the same thing. It's often the buzzword topic these days in terms of productivity and things like that is imposter syndrome. And how do you overcome imposter syndrome? And I got asked this on a podcast myself the other day, and I was like, I don't consider imposter syndrome necessarily a bad thing. If you let it paralyze you, it is. But it's my imposter syndrome that's kept me pushing for more. That and my obsession. So like, I'm not satisfied where I am. I'm going to push to learn for more. And like you said, it's like when I first started, when I first walked into the doors at UP, it was the people around me that were the people I looked up to. And then it's like, when I was in Virgin Active, it was the person who did the most sessions. And now coming out into the big wide world with social media, I'm looking at, I can look and compare myself to people like yourself and then Jordan Shallow. And, the names get bigger and the ceiling just gets higher. And I just have to keep sort of like trying to rise. And like, as you said, if I compared myself to someone like you, you've got just under a decade on me, probably maybe more in the industry. So it's just a case of as long as I'm keeping my head down, keeping focused, these things will come up. So with your education, either past or present, I mean, like you mentioned, obviously going to courses very frequently, but how much of your day is spent around improving your education? Because I think there's a lot of coaches out there now who want to be educators. And I work with a lot of coaches and mentor a lot of coaches, and often they underestimate the amount of time and effort in the back end that goes into learning your craft. For me, I always looked at studying as an investment for me in 5 years, and I prioritize that as much as anything else. Like, how much of your day is based around becoming a better Cass?
Well, every minute that I can afford, technically. I mean, if you were to follow me around, like if I were to do a day in a life video, you would see that I am, we'll say, call it on, like the majority of the time. And it's, the hard part is shutting it off. And that means that, if I'm walking the dog, I'm trying to find something to listen to, right? Or if I'm driving the car, like basically I try not to have any dead space in my mind, especially like as soon as I get a bug, as soon as I get a train of thought that I want to go and investigate, like I will throw the work that I'm supposed to be doing on the wayside and hunt down, some research or something like that, or look at it, or I'll be like, okay, I know we were supposed to do this and this, but I want to change and I want to run these protocols in the lab this week because I want to know and I want to know now, which is awesome that we have that ability to do that sometimes now, which is like, hey, I want to see if we do this, if it seems to stimulate that muscle better than this other thing, right? Just, the number of times where I'm in the shower and I'm like, you know what? If we added this amount of rotation here, would that make it easier to get in the right position for this exercise? And then, like a few fumbles around in the lab later, we can either confirm or, deny that, which is kind of cool, versus like just waiting to see, okay, hopefully somebody does a paper on this at some point in time. But the challenge is that we'll say the more I do that, there is that whole like burning, the candle at both ends, if you will. Right. And so I will go through like, okay, I will be like that. And then all of a sudden I will hit a wall and be like, okay, now I need 2 days of just, like absolutely nothing to recharge. Right. So, and then I'll shut all the stuff. I'll go up in the mountains or whatever it is, recharge. And then as I come back, I always find that my productivity then elevates. So as much as I, try to say like, yeah, I try to work hard, but I also understand that just working hard is not necessarily working smart. So I have to recognize when my productivity starts to come down. Mm-hmm. So everybody, you have to find that dose for yourself of like, what is a reasonable amount for me to do in a week, to do in a day, to do in a month or whatever before I need to. And for some people, it's not a sprint or blast and cruise like I do, where it's like, okay, today I'm like, I don't care if I work till 9 o'clock at night and I'm still going through this stuff. And then in bed, when I'm trying to sleep, I probably spend at least three of those hours, like running these thoughts in my head, et cetera, like is all focused on that. And then, then it does take a lot of time to recover. But for other people, it might be like, no, I'm going to spend like the first 30 minutes of my day. That's when I'm going to read or whatever it may be. Right. I think the most important thing is that you just do it constantly. Is you just make it as like, I'm not going to take this course and then just stop. You should be like, I'm going to take this course, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to audit that information and I'm going to decide what things I want to research further. I'm going to make a plan for how I'm going to audit that, because every course you go to is going to have some good stuff, some bad stuff, some things that just simply may not apply to you or your clientele or whatever. And other things where it's like, this doesn't apply right now, but I know it's going to be important. So I want to make sure I put in the notes and do the work now so that I have that information later when that client that needs it comes along, or et cetera, or when I change to that phase of my career, right? Like for instance, we'll get people that either only train in person or only train online, and we'll kind of cover a little bit of stuff on both. And it's like, hey, even if you don't do this now, remember this, because you're going to want it later if you ever decide to dip your toe in the other pond.
Yeah. I also think sometimes it's important to, to learn some things you might not think you need, because you'll be surprised how much you need them. Like the example I always use is the booming culture of online coaching right now. Whereas online coaching now was either 5-10 years ago, was either someone did as a side hustle, or it was something that someone went into after 5-10 years of the industry and he just needed to scale their business. Whereas now you see people never being on the gym floor coming into this. And it's like, that's where people may skip, say, for your biomechanics course because they're not on the gym floor. But as soon as a client comes in on a check-in and go, I'm getting a bit of knee pain on this exercise, you have no idea what to do. And even if it might not be your day-to-day, I think it's so important to have a much more wide round sort of knowledge. And I'm like you, I'm very much, I need to block myself in time for a hobby, because I've got a little bit of ADHD in the sense of I can struggle to focus on the simplest of tasks one day and have hyper focus till 4 a.m., not looking up from my laptop the next day just because a client didn't feel something the way I thought and the setup looked right. And I'm there going, I need to work this out. I won't settle until I do.
That's exactly why I retired from coaching, because it allows me to apply all of my personality defects to this stuff and not have to sacrifice the service of coaching, right? Like, to be a good coach, you need to be able to put the client first. And I was like, if I want to take N1 where I want to take N1, I have to remove any obstacles and just let my brain do what it wants to do and just go straight after this one thing.
Yeah, I think, I've never seen the phrase until I tried to do a bit of online and one-to-one at the same time, that lacking on sleep is borrowing from the next day. You're not getting extra time on that day, you're borrowing from the next day. Yeah, and then your first couple of clients, you're sort of just trying to caffeinate yourself and wake yourself up. How did you do you find, because now I'm starting to do more online coaching myself, I find them in a way very different skills. In the sense of, you'll think long-term programming for your one-to-one clients, but you'll often get people who are affording personal training for the most part are probably going to be office workers, bankers, finance guys, busy guys like that, where they may not have everything dialed in outside the gym. They may come in 5-10 minutes late, and you're thinking of the micro. Let's set them up. Let's work around injuries. Let's do this. Whereas when you've got an online coach, it's now, right, let's set you up for the next 6 years. Do you find that with what you do now, moving away from the gym floor and working with clients at N1, or because of the kind of clientele you get, it still becomes a little bit of everything?
Yeah. Well, I think it kind of depends on what the niche you had as a one-on-one client. If you're working with general pop, what tends to happen if you move to online is that you tend to get we'll say a slightly more advanced clientele because they're obviously confident. I mean, it's not 100% that, but they're obviously confident that they can, use less instruction to be successful, right? And obviously you're giving up control of the session per se. I mean, you might be writing them a program, but you can't tell them to do two more in the middle of a set. In that program, you can't adjust their form and all that other stuff live. So, in my opinion, there are certain. I mean, there's definitely skills that have to be very different, both from a communication standpoint and whatnot. But I would make the argument that if you want to talk about the people that deliver the absolute best online coaching, that their skill set has to be better because they have to be able to communicate things in a like using a suboptimal format, right? Like they have to be able to okay, I got to be able to send this a video. I got to send it over text or, I got to in a voice message, et cetera. Whereas, being able to communicate something with a client by simply moving their arm or adjusting a cable forward, all of those things, and being able to on the day ask those questions of well, what did you do last night? Or what did you eat today? Or, what's going on? To have that on the day feedback, that makes your life a lot easier. And to be able to communicate in those direct mechanisms makes it a lot easier. As an online coach, you now don't have that great communication skill, right? And you don't have that on the day feedback. You have to be all right, maybe I get check-ins once a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever, however your system is set up. So you have to be more analytical. You have to look at more metrics, or you have to be just so much better at communicating or providing resources and all that stuff. You have to predict all of the obstacles that your clients are going to run into so that you can have a resource ready so you can communicate that better than just simply trying to write something back in an email or whatever. Right. So a big part of, what we did before we did any online programs or whatever is we built a huge exercise library and a ton of articles and all of that other stuff. Because it's look, this process will be terrible, at least by our standards, if we don't have just this huge library of resources to be able to afford a client. So that way, when they have a question on something, one, you don't have to write the same email 5,000 times, but you also have a way of delivering that information that is in more depth than what you would be able to cover in a simple response. And maybe if it's the combination of, text and video and audio and images, et cetera, you provide it in a way where you can communicate that information as good as possible. Right. Yeah. So I think if you want to be good at online, you actually have to have more tools in your toolbox, and you have to be better at communicating those tools. And that's not to take anything away from people that train in person. It's just, you have a lot of luxuries when you're training people in person.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really, really important you said that about the resources and the back end of what you built at N1 to help your online clients, because, it's in the name, N equals one. That it's a very personalized service. And I find often when I work with coaches, especially online coaches, it's they confuse a truly tailored experience with, I've got to start with a blank piece of paper, otherwise it's not personal. And I think, in my argument, I think that's a less personal service, because if I've got, I take my intake form of a questionnaire, I've got rough ideas of what my various programs are for the stimuluses that I'm looking to achieve. I have articles to help them out. I've got the exercise library. I've got everything there ready to go. And then I go, right, what does he struggle with in terms of his range? What's his recovery like? Okay, like a tree, this is the right thing for him. I tweak this here and here, and on it goes. Whereas that person that starts with a blank piece of paper can often get overwhelmed with where do I start? And it takes 4 or 5 days for a client to get the program to you. And that's the time you could have been actually coaching. That initial program, as specific as you are, I'm sure you'll agree that it's about getting something to them first, seeing how they get on and going, okay, that needs to change, that needs to change, that needs to change there. But if you end up spending so long on that initial part because you're starting from scratch, it's a mammoth process where your client can tune out before they even start.
Yeah, it's the difference between pursuing, perfection and progress, right? The people that want to do everything completely from scratch. They're I have this person, and so I want to make that perfect, that first program, that first everything perfect for them. And while the idea of that is nice, the economics of it are terrible, for one, right? The amount of time it'll take and whatnot, but also because the client is a factor, it just tends to be a waste because a client can only implement so many changes to their lifestyle and their training. Like they have a learning curve, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if you had everything perfect because they're not going to do it perfectly. So you have to find that balance of like, how can I provide them the best starting point that then now the thing that I just gave them is now the new assessment point. So then we can improve upon that for the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one. And that's what I try and instill on people that tend to be a little myopic with, how they're looking at, individualized stuff. I mean, individualized, there's a lot of things that you can do, to, we'll say, streamline that process, but still be very thoughtful initially in terms of like exercise selection, the stimulus and all of that stuff. Right. But you're not going to have somebody like, okay, week one, I need you to like watch these 6 hours of, videos or whatever, so that you do everything right. You calculate every macro right. You do all of your lifestyle stuff right. You do every exercise perfectly. You track your RPEs or RIRs and all that other stuff. I just need you to become a completely different person in 24 hours. Could you do that for me? Because that would make my job so much easier. But that's never going to happen. Your goal is to get them to be a, we'll say a decently better version of themselves over the course of, like weeks and months of habit building, right? And practice and application.
So when it comes to obviously like data tracking there, you mentioned a few times, and obviously that's a very important part of anything. But there is always that line, especially with newer clients, where that data tracking becomes too much. Like when you're taking on a new client, what do you consider the important things for someone to keep an eye on that will guide your process as a coach? And how do you start to layer on data points as you go through a process?
Yeah. So when we do our initial assessment, what I'm trying to figure out are looking at data in two ways. I'm trying to figure out which data points are going to be physiologically the most important, right? But also I'm trying to think of what are the things that this person is capable and willing to do that will have basically the lowest cost for them, either time, effort, money, et cetera, right? And you're trying to find the combination of those two, because sometimes the win is picking a bunch of things for your client that basically they have no objection to and require no extra time investment or whatever, like for instance, this is an example I like to use, like, there's tons of controversial topics. You say anything, you say like, oh, blue blockers, right? That's an example, right? And some people are like, oh, blue blockers are stupid. Like, they're wasting your money and whatever. I'm like, well, if you have a lot of money and putting on blue blockers is like a zero objectionable thing for you to do, but putting off of your screen or not watching the movie with your spouse or whatever it is much more objectionable. Then it's like, well, throw the money at the blue blockers. Cause that's the, it may not be the best change, but if it's a zero cost to the client, they're willing to implement it, no questions asked. Sure. Like, oh, I can wear those things. Like, then why wouldn't you be like, okay, why don't we start there? Because if that makes a little bit of a difference, then I have buy-in for them to maybe work towards a change that was a little bit more objectionable, right? So I'm trying to look at the physiological stuff, like, okay, what do we absolutely have to do, right? And if I can get by not having to force, especially a brand new client, to do any of the things that they would consider most objectionable, right? And usually if you do an interview, you kind of get an idea of like a readiness to change type of assessment on them, right? But you also, you ask about their lifestyle and the stuff that they want to do or whatever, right? So if you have, one of the questions that I'll often ask is like, well, okay, would you rather work twice as hard or eat half as much? Because that just lets me psychologically know right there, what am I likely going to be able to manage here a little bit more objectively? Like, okay, so maybe this person, I'll be better off, like, pushing their training, convincing them to do an extra session, getting steps in or whatever, versus being super neurotic about tracking, their food or whatever. Maybe I go, all right, let's try and go with a less objectionable thing on the nutrition side, and we can go for a more aggressive thing on the training side, because I know compliance wise and lifestyle wise, they're just going to, conform to that better. So that's what I'm looking at. So I don't have like, obviously you can throw the big ones out there, it's like, okay, I'm looking at sleep, that's a huge one, and just digest, like just trying to figure out, like, does this person have any, major health problems, right? Or whatever. So I can be like, oh yeah, Like, I wonder why they're not recovering this week. Oh, you've been, peeing out your butthole the whole week because, you don't tolerate this thing or whatever. Like really small story here. So pro bodybuilder goes to one of the, we'll say, biggest names in, the coaching, industry in terms of like, the Olympians. Won't drop any names, right? But the information that bodybuilder gives this, elite level coach is like, I don't tolerate dairy or peanut butter very well, blah, 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 whatever, right? 50% of the meals were whey protein and peanut butter, right? For the bodybuilder that says, I don't tolerate dairy and peanut butter, right? And I'm like, but guess what? Bodybuilder did the diet anyway. And I mean, I'm sure you can guess what the result is, right?
Yeah.
But, so, that's where it's like, okay, what's the most important data point might be different on some people, right? Like, so like from the nutritional standpoint, sometimes, it'll be more of a, the structuring of it, and then it will be the macros at the beginning, right? Because people, if you have that person, it's like, I'm just so hungry at night. I'm like, okay, well, we have to resolve that issue before I'm saying, hey, you have to eat this many calories or whatever. Right. Because it's like, if the obstacle is going to be like, well, we'll set this, you'll calculate it, but then at night you're going to be binging with this or whatever. But like, okay, why don't we start tracking, things that are relevant to what makes you hungry at night and what things would maybe change that, et cetera. I think, when I was over there, we did like the fruit before bed thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
For some people. Right. And it's like, for some people, like, like Charles would have rolled over in his grave if he was like, oh, you got your fat loss client, that's like 40% obese, like giant subscap, and you're going to slam fruit before bed. I'm like, yeah, but all of a sudden they sleep and all their blood sugar markers get better. Like, so context matters, right?
I think it's really interesting talking about the bodybuilder story, and it's I think it's important. This goes back. I always find podcasts go full circle at various points, and this goes back in terms of the education and knowing more than you maybe think you need to know with a client. And I remember a similar story with a client with dairy. This is more the client's thing than mine. And I always ask in my intake forms, obviously as you should, is there any things that don't agree with you? Is there any food intolerances that you're aware of? It's like just eggplant. And I know sometimes how people just rush through those forms and they're half paying attention. So I say it again initially, like, is there anything at all that gives you any symptoms whatsoever? It's like, no, just eggplant. So I sent him his meal plan. And for the first few weeks, like the targets I'd given him in his food was completely way off. And every week I was like, hey, your protein's like 10 grams and your carbs like 500. Like we set this way. He's like, oh, okay. Next week, same thing. Next week, same thing. And eventually I was like, okay, let's sit down. What are we doing here? Why is it? What's struggling? Because where can I help you? And he thought I generally owned MyFitnessPal, and he thought the targets that MyFitnessPal set him were the targets that I'd given him. I'm like, no, remember that meal plan I walked you through? Like, put them into MyFitnessPal. Here, let me do it. And then a week later, he comes to me and goes, I've been taking your protein powder that you put in the meal plan. I went, okay. He goes, is it meant to be burning? I went, or maybe you've got some issues with dairy you weren't aware about. He goes, oh yeah, I'm lactose intolerant. I'm just like, and that's an extreme example of somebody who's like, no issues. But if I could have spent another 6 to 8 weeks, so I hadn't been aware of some of the symptoms that he was facing, and go track it back to sort of there. But going on to the data thing, one of the things that's the important part in all of your courses, it's in your nutrition and program design course, it's in the pre-course information for your in-person seminars, is the concept of trainability, which essentially encompasses this. And it's something that I thought was put in a really unique way that I thought really resonated with the way how I like to work and gave you many more options with how to approach someone's programming. So could you just overview of what trainability is and how you use it within your coaching?
Yeah. So trainability basically is the measure of how much of a certain stimulus that you will need to get a positive adaptation. And essentially, as we start to train in any specific way, that threshold starts to go up. We start to need more stimulus to continue to progress, right? Like if you start running, if you want to run faster, then you've got to try to run faster. If you want to be able to run longer, then you got to try and run longer. If you want to lift heavier weights, then you got to lift heavier weights, and you got to lift them with more volume and intensity, like all of those things. And our physiology works in the same way, in that basically once we kind of receive a stress in our body, it says like, okay, we don't like that, or that's slightly objectionable. Let's have an adaptation response, right? Genes turn on, proteins get synthesized, all sorts of wonderful things happen. But now the next time you meet that same stress, if you have adapted well enough, it's gonna be like, we don't need to change. We handle this now, right? And so the concept of trainability is essentially trying to figure out what things that you can do with an individual that won't take a lot of stress and effort. Because if you periodize appropriately, we're always decreasing our trainability in the thing that we're working on, but other things that we may not be stressing are increasing their trainability. They're becoming the low hanging fruit. And this is one of the benefits of, kind of periodizing around through different types of stresses, is that instead of having to like just progress, more harder, you can simply rotate the things that you're doing appropriate to that person. And then all of a sudden you are more sensitive. It doesn't take as much volume or as much effort, to get the same or better benefit as the last time that you did it. And so it's just being mindful of a little bit of the physiology so that you can kind of understand, will this person benefit from this type of stress? Because there are stresses that a person can have that aren't training related, but will overlap with training. Like, for example, if somebody has a bunch of chronic inflammation, training in a way where inflammation is one of the key components of that adaptation probably isn't going to be good, because they already have chronic inflammation. So guess what? Like, they're not going to get much of a positive experience in throwing more inflammation in their system, right? It might even be worse, right? Because it becomes a point in time where what you would need for a positive response is just outweighed by the stress, right? So it's just like, there's no benefit from it. So what you would want to do is you would want to purposely train them in a way and switch over their nutrition, their lifestyle, et cetera. So basically you were eliminating as many of those causes of inflammation and everything could calm down. And then while you're doing your other stuff, then that would resensitize. And then you could go back to that type of training. So one of the things that we typically do is whatever a goal a person comes in with, the initial program that we put them on, if it's a person that's been training, is almost never something they would directly associate with that goal. Like, the majority of the people that come to get jacked end up going through some sort of conditioning protocol initially, because it's like, yeah, great. You might even be like 6% body fat, right? But you're out of, like, you're a turd, you're out of shape. Like, this is me sitting here talking this, like 19% body fat. But anyway, I just climbed a mountain, so I'm in shape fat. So I can say that, right? But I mean, that's essentially what you're trying to do is like, hey, how do I make it as easy as possible for this person to progress, rather than trying to push them towards a goalpost that's like just moving up a steeper and steeper incline away from them, right? When I could just say, hey, why don't we take a week or two, a phase, a cycle over here, and then we can come back to that and we'll make progress there much easier. And so we tend to use shorter mesocycles and rotate things around a little bit more than what you typically see in the industry. And a big part of that is just us trying to say, hey, we can move towards the goal, but instead of having to move in a straight line, what we can do is we can zig and zag and actually get there faster over time, because as we're zigging and zagging, we'll be able to move there with less effort, right? It's like we're zigging and zagging on a flat surface instead of trying to move in a straight line uphill. It's kind of an analogy that makes more sense when I draw it. But if you can imagine, like, if you were zigzagging left and right, but you were running flat, that would be less effort than running up a very steep, incline that just kept getting, harder and harder and harder.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also think as well, it offers you ability to plug some of those weaknesses that probably people don't think about, right? I mean, if you pick someone that comes in their goal as hypertrophy, and they've probably gone hypertrophy the whole of their last year of training, they may have delved into a little bit of strength. And when they think of addressing weak points, they think of my triceps are affecting my bench press, or, my lats aren't strong enough, as opposed to thinking, when I get to 10 reps of a leg press, I am gassed. So like going into some sort of systemic block, maybe not only pulling them away from that stimulus, but also could be plugging the gap that stops the hypertrophy cycle actually being progressive. So when you come back to it, not only they're ready for that stimulus, they're also much better placed for us to get more from it in the first place. Like I recently started working with Blake from Alan Cress's team, and the same sort of thing. And I was out of shape by my standards. I'd enjoyed dim sum and Hong Kong lifestyle way too much over the last 2 years. And I was put on straight on a systemic half body split. And I hadn't done that in years. And as horrible as it was for those 3 weeks, I am I'm so glad I went through that process. Like every phase after that was better as a process. I was recovering better, I was performing better, and particularly my leg training, it wasn't my heart rate that was giving way. It actually was my muscles, and I actually got more out of those things. But when it comes to being very specific with the stimulus, this is something I've always been intrigued about, is that if you get somebody who is maybe a little bit more deconditioned, and what would be a sort of systemic, aerobically based stimulus for someone else, maybe half of what it is for them, right? Because their conditioning isn't where it needs to be. Like, how specific can you be with those kind of people? And how much of it is like, how does fatigue play a role? Because I can imagine that if you put this perfect sort of hypertrophy split with a more strength split, the A series becomes very targeted. But by the time you get to the C series, the amount of fatigue will surely push them into a sort of different threshold. Do you find that, or is it not the case, if that makes sense?
Well, okay. So the thing is that once you kind of figure out the stimulus, there isn't like one way to write a program for that stimulus, right? So, and this is a course we've only taught live, which is a program design course that hopefully will be moving to the online portion here in 2022. But what we do is like for a given stimulus, we go through, okay, here's the architecture of different types of programs. So for instance, German body comp, right? That's like an architecture of programming, right? Where it's just like, okay, we're supersetting, upper lower body, you can call it peripheral heart method or whatever, right? And there's that general structure of you have the A's, B's, C's, whatever. And so, a different archetype that we went over when I was with you guys is we talked about backloading, right? Which was just simply, we took the exercises that are typically the A's, which were your big output exercise, and we just moved them to the end. And that's a totally now different experience, and it allows you to do and focus on different things, right? And that's probably like one of the smallest changes in archetype. But like once you get into hypertrophy, it's like, man, there are so many strategies that you can take to now approach the stimulus, and some will be better for somebody that's doing a lot of volume over, very few days. Some will be better for somebody that's doing, higher frequency, but lower volume per day. Some will be better for just higher volume overall, lower volume all. Some will be better for a person that's limited on exercise. Some will be better for a person that has like every exercise imaginable, whatever. So, so there's all of these different ways to approach that physiological goal. Right. And this is where I really enjoy the creativity of program design. Right? This is like, okay, now that we've separated stimulus, I know exactly what I want this combination of exercises and sets and reps and tempos and all of these things. I know what I want that physiological outcome to be. And now I have the constraints of the person, which is, how many times, how long they can work out, their relative skill, how much fatigue they can tell, all of these other things, how close to failure can we get? And then I can be like, all right, how do I take their limitations, but also build something that will accomplish this goal, right? And so you can be very specific, but it has to be more specific than the stimulus, right? The stimulus gets you to what you want to accomplish physiologically, but now the nuts and bolts that you use to accomplish that, then there's a ton of latitude for that, right? I mean, let's like a very simple one is like local metabolic, right? It's like, well, what are all the different ways that you can make a single tissue work harder longer? You could just do higher reps. You could do supersets. You could do trisets, giant sets, drop sets, cluster. Like there's just so many different ways, right? And, one of those might be good on a squat, but terrible on a leg extension. And another might be, the reverse, right? So like, for instance, like remember Charles's like 20 rep breathing squats or whatever, you do a rep and whatever. Imagine trying to do that on like a bicep curl or a leg extension, right? You wouldn't do 20 singles probably, right? Like, it sucks for squats, but if we're just talking about physiologically, it's like, yeah, that probably would not be how I would do that. So it's just, you have so many ways and you can figure out like, well, what's going to be the best for this particular person? Is it going to be just to use high reps, or do we need to find a way to make that do we need to figure a way to make 20 reps more intense by making it a superset of 10 and then another 10 so that the first 10 can be at a relative higher intensity? Like which one of those is going to apply better to this individual, right? Or does it need to be even further? It needs to be a triset, right? Or it needs to be a drop set, et cetera.
I think that
for instance,
go.
I was just saying, it's like, so really another simple one is like, look, if you have access to tons of exercises and like I can split up the divisions of the pecs or triceps or whatever it may be, it's like, cool. Then supersets and trisets are awesome. You have very little equipment. Well, then drop sets work really good when you only have one exercise, right? Or mechanical drops, right? Or rest pauses, or like, so I keep using the phrase for the people that are coming to the events. It's like, look, just pretend you're a kid again, right? And instead of stressing about this stuff, enjoy the figuring it out process, right? Because if you don't enjoy that, then you probably shouldn't have a job where you write programs all day, because you're going to be miserable.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It comes almost full circle about having a system again. And we spoke about like creating a system in your program and how that creates more individualization in programs. I think this is really key. Like I remember for a while, I was working on like, how do I teach program design to the trainers that I worked with and mentored at the time, and certainly on a many-to-one setting, which obviously you're way more familiar with than I am. I was like, if I created a tick list, if I created some pillars of where program design is, so let's say, you pick your periodization, you pick your stimulus as number one. Now that goes from, I've got a blank piece of paper with all these informations, where there's a drop set, where is this? It's just so complicated. It's like, right, hypertrophy. Cool. So now we have the reps. That's already taken care of. That probably takes care of a range of rest periods that we're probably going to use, and a set range we're not going to use. We're not going to do, 18 sets of 10. That'll be a 3-hour workout. So it guides your decision-making process down, but it does become play, because there's a system around all the big things that when you get to the gym floor component, it's like, right, I've got all these parameters. And that's how I play and work around what's going to be the best way of doing this. And like some of the best lessons I've ever learned has been getting on the gym floor and doing stuff. Some very, very sensible stuff, some very dumb stuff that I've taken. Okay, there's 1 to 2% of this that's really good. Like the old 10 exercise giant sets, UP hypertrophy leg days, right? Like I would never give most of my clients a 10 exercise giant set on quads, but the things I learned from going through that process mentally and physically are really important. And I remember doing a workout was with an old colleague of mine, and it was just between Christmas and New Year. We hadn't trained for a week, and we're like, should we just do a workout to get back into it? And we just wrote this workout out on paper. We weren't thinking too much about it. Just like, let's just do a full body, death circuit to get us back in. Nothing crazy and load. And we did Nordic curls, ring push-ups, and then the killers here were Bulgarian split squat, left leg into left arm single arm row, then into right leg Bulgarian split squat into right arm single arm row. And I was like, the difference that if I done those straight sets, or if I put those exercises at the opposite end of the circuit, how different that feeling and that effect and that stimulus would have been just by doing upper lower within the same two superset was unbelievable. And if someone can actually do that, there's potentially a lot of benefits there. And it only came from playing on the gym floor. And I think it's something that I think a lot of coaches miss out on. Again, going back to that, going straight into the online thing. One of the things I always encourage people to do when they study, it's like, right, you've learned the anatomy of the pec. You've gone and watched a video from Cass or John Shallow or whoever about how it actually works. Now get on the gym floor and play around with stuff, because that's sort of how you really learn how it truly works and see and visualize it.
I think a big thing that the new generation of coaches is missing out on, and I give Cody, who's one of our younger guys, shit about this all the time, is that like we went around to all of these courses, and in that era, everybody was just trying to come up basically with a different way to kill you. That's essentially like people were just coming up with just like the most disgusting like this was before there was anything like RPE was not a thing, right? There were no reps left or whatever, right? So the workouts and the suffering that we went through in that era, and the amount of things that you learn both from a character building perspective, but also if you do a lot of hard things, you start to realize the nuanced differences in those hard things and what makes, the hardest things really, really hard and whatnot. And I think, there are so many people now that are jumping into this industry that it's not that I don't want to say that they've just never trained hard, but they definitely have not been exposed to a lot of very challenging things in the gym that you just can't learn about by reading about them. Right. And that's one of the reasons that like at the practicals, that we make people train hard, right? So, I mean, the workout that you guys went through, because there was like 50 of you guys or whatever, right? Like that was grueling. There was like it was, it was like 16 circuits or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I totally agree with that. I think some of the best lessons, the best, things I've got from courses is like getting hands-on and getting like, I can't think of a better word than play on the gym floor and learning these things firsthand, which I do think is less common today. And as well, I think this is where sometimes I think the over-reliance sometimes on research without the practical application of it can be a hindrance, because people read into RAR and RPE and they think about their training in a bigger picture. It's like, okay, this day will affect this day and this, and which is great. And we want that. That's progression in the industry. But at the same time, the amount of times where you've gone, right, we're going to do a team training in this session so you can learn how to train. Oh yeah, but I'm on prep and I've got to do biceps tomorrow and this back session will affect that. And I'm like, I used to train legs every Friday at 10 a.m. with Eddie Baruta. And like, he didn't give a fuck what you had on Saturday's training session. You just did it. And like, sometimes, yeah, that was a hindrance. But I tell you what, I learned more from getting out of my comfort zone and being stuck in and sort of evolved in embedded in that sort of process, that I know what's useful and what's not.
I think the industry's gotten a little, we'll say, anti-discovery, meaning that it's not like if like it's even for me, right? And my following, I'm very transparent with them. So if I just decide to play around in the gym, or whatever, and I was like, hey, I rigged up this exercise or whatever, I did this thing or whatever today, and I thought it was cool. I'm sharing it with you guys. Like the number of people that will just want to just poo-poo that idea or whatever. Like, it's like, so I can only imagine what it's like for somebody that doesn't have the authority that I have. Right. And it's like, oh, I just wanted to try this out, or, my friend, my buddy or whatever trains at this other gym, maybe it's a CrossFit or whatever. I just decided to go and see what it was like. Right. And the amount of hate, right. The amount of people that will just tell you like, oh, you're stupid and whatever, because you did that thing. And I'm like, so I decided to go do something on my Saturday, and you had nothing better to do than to get on the internet and talk bad about the thing that I actually went and did.
Yeah,
awesome, dude.
I think this brings me on to a question. I think is probably one of the. If there's one you're going to go off on a tangent with, I mean, I'm all welcome. It's probably going to be this one, but you kind of led into it quite nicely. But I've known you for a while. I've known you speak about wanting to bring integrity to this industry, and it's something that's very shown on everything you do, to the point where you've almost become almost like the sheriff of the fitness industry, and you've almost had a number of debates over the last few years. And and certainly you think that that becomes an important part of this industry. How certainly in today's world, in 2021, in anything, but fitness is obviously what we know. What is the importance, do you think, of intellectual debate today? And do you feel that it's being lost?
It's definitely becoming much, much more of a challenge, right? So the obstacles that I've had, right? And my intention is not to be the sheriff in the industry, but I'm not afraid to share my opinions on things.
Yes.
And I tend to be very objective rather than just saying, like, that guy's an idiot or I don't like that.
Yeah.
I tend to always give an explanation, and somehow that often actually has more of a negative interaction, from the person with the opposing viewpoint than if you were to just like blatantly insult them or whatever. Like that seems to be more acceptable, and people are, but if you actually provide, a logic or thought that's contrary, and then that's where it becomes really bad. But the challenge for me has been able to find people that are, one, enjoy having the debate, but two, can understand that like you can disagree about with something and it is not personal. Right. Like the person that has proved me the wrong the most of my career is me. Right. So, and I try not to hate myself too much for that. Right. I try to appreciate that. And I think, we're in this place where you have people that, if someone disagrees with them, they take it personal, which means the debate quickly, like just degrades to non-productive stuff.
Yeah.
And it's also it's challenging now because I think I wish we had a platform or some way some format where we could organize intellectual debate. I mean, podcasts right now are essentially the only thing that we have. So the few podcasts where people get on and talk to each other is about it, right? But if I reach out to somebody that I disagree with and say, hey, let's talk about this, very, very few people will take me up onto that, right? Yeah. So like, I mean, you mentioned Jordan Shallow. He's one of the very few.
Pat Davidson,
right? And is another one. Well, kind of like Pat, like, we talked about one topic or whatever, but now Pat will never like debate or discuss with me ever again. That's like the current status. Okay. So I thought it, but I was wrong. Okay. But I mean, no, like I crave that because I'm addicted to wanting, like, if I'm wrong, I want to figure it out now. And I want to know why. Yeah. And I also just love discussing the nuances of it. Right. Cause there's a lot of things where two people can not be wrong right now because we just don't have enough information to know what's right. And a lot of people are not willing to accept that. And I'm totally willing to say, hey, I believe in the argument that I have. You believe in a different argument. We can make those arguments together. But if neither one of us has a good enough case to make the other person completely change our views, that does not mean that we have to hate each other. That means that we should both be, all right, I know there's another argument out there that has maybe some valid, or at least some people think that this is, a valid case. So as I'm continuing my thought process, I need to keep that. That's the way of me kind of fighting my biases, is of being as aware as possible and steel manning the other position as much as possible. Right. Yeah.
I think it's one of those things that, the people are in a world now, especially with social media, where you can find Instagram accounts and Facebook accounts that follow your confirmation bias, that the ego has become more and more fragile as people go through this, go through life. And not just in this, we're in a world where Mr. Potato Head can't be a Mister, and we're killing off male role models in cinema left, right, and center. So, it's one of those things where camps become really, really, opinionated. And I think often you mention the people that don't respond well to these things. It's probably because they'd rather be called a dick because they can ignore that comment. But as soon as someone comes in and gives another side of the story, that's where the ego then has to take a hit. And I've always encouraged it, because I'm generally one of these people that I said at the start of this podcast, imposter syndrome I consider as a positive thing because it allows me to get better and put myself in environments and circles that are going to challenge my way of thinking. And I don't think you can do that by surrounding yourself with people that just think you're the best. But it's, as you said, it's like you've managed to get on and have these debates with these people, and you may not agree, but it doesn't mean like you're now working together to find something, a common ground. I'm sure if you both came to a conclusion that there's not enough information out there, I'm sure you would go and tell this person when there was more information out there, and vice versa. You've now become working for the same cause rather than being opposite sides of the coin, just a proper conversation.
There used to be this industry where basically, somebody would, they would have evidence of something, right? Mm-hmm. And basically the whole goal of another group would be to figure out if that was true and disprove it or whatever. And we used to call that science. But it just seems to be something we don't do. We're not interested in that mindset anymore. And I can understand, we'll put it this way, I can sympathize and empathize with the people that are just trying to focus on their business. Because obviously, like, and that's, I mean, if I was to teach a business course or whatever, it would be a pretty shitty business course, because the way I do things is very particular to our brand, right? And it requires you to have a product, we'll say, as good as ours. And what a lot of people, like, if their focus is on building the business, they would make very different decisions than what we've done. And my thought has been, if I do the things that focus on the integrity of our brand and the information and whatnot, the business will fall in place, which is good for me because I have very little interest in focusing on the business things. So I'm basically trying to use my skills to the best of my ability and hope that pays off in the long run. But I understand, you might have a business that takes a lot of your time, right? And you might be like, hey, whatever these debates are, these nuance, they're not relevant to, you know, maybe you sell a product that's like for beginners or whatnot and stuff. So I just think for a lot of people, if they're in this for the business perspective, there's a kind of a cap on their intellectual pursuit for it. Once the business once it scales to either a certain amount of time commitment, a certain amount of financial access or whatever, there's a lot of different reasons where then people are just like, oh, okay. I mean, and you will see this consistently. And this is what I'm hoping. Like, I don't know when you're going to watch this, but I'm getting really close to that 100,000 followers on Instagram or whatever. But what you'll see is a lot of people start changing the content they produce, and once they reach once they put in enough work to reach a certain success threshold, it's now all it is like, well, how do I capitalize on that more? Yeah. From a business perspective, right? So it's like, okay, I got this many followers, cool. So should we continue trying to innovate the product? Now, keep selling the product, same one will sell for a decade. But why don't we also start selling supplements and clothing? And I'm not taking jabs at anybody that does those things, right? You know, we may do those things in the future. But it just seems that, like, you know, if you're focused on the business, you're going to focus on the things going to have the biggest impact on the business. And if right now the quality of your product is not keeping anybody from buying it, a lot of people are going to be like, oh, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Right. And my obsessive nature is just such that we've been changing our product the whole time that we've been in existence. Right. So my staff, you know, they probably hate me, you know, deep down a lot for, you know, the number of times that, you know, we're like, oh, you know, I don't like that. Let's redo that module. Let's retweak how we're saying this, how we're teaching this, you know, we used to teach PECs that way. Well, guess not. We're not doing that anymore. You know, et cetera. But I enjoy, like, that is where in the business I want to be. Right. And so the other aspect of it, I think, is just that social media is anti-nuance. It's anti-nuance, and there's no segregation, meaning that, you know, for me to have a discussion with somebody that I would consider, you know, on par, you know, as an intellectual or whatever. Right. And that's not me trying to talk down, but it's like, you know, if somebody has enough reputation, then I know that it might be worth having a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. You know, but just person with no profile picture up or whatever just shows up and be like, you're stupid, blah, 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 right? I'm going to hit that block button. People are like, oh, so this person disagreed with you and you just blocked them. And I'm like, there's a big difference between me wanting to debate other people who I respect their, you know, contrarian thoughts on this versus people that just have nothing better to do and are completely dishonest with where they are in their own education and whatnot. And they just want to come on and just like assume that, hey, if I have a different opinion than this person, that person then owes me their time. I always think that's funny. Like, yeah. When somebody requests a debate and I'm like, I have no idea who you are, like, or what you do or whatever, right? Like, I see no business, no following, no credentials, no nothing. You're just colors on the screen. That's all you are. And so you're asking me at my stage in my career to take my time away from what I'm doing, and then come down and argue with you because you have a really bad idea.
You can tell subtext as well, right? You can tell subtext in the sense of when someone comments on a post, you can say, this person, regardless whether it's the following or not, even a small following, this person wants to learn more. This person's trying to understand. Rather than this person is, I'm criticizing, because if I criticize and I get it right, or if other people think I get it right, people see me as also an expert and will follow my page, which is a very dishonest way of actually having a debate. You're not having a debate because you want to know the answer. You're having a debate because it might get more eyes on your profile, which sort of defeats the point.
I actually see less of that. And I see more people that are just criticizing because they're bored. Because we'll put it this way. The majority of the trolls that I have that come on my page are not anybody that's known. Like, I almost never get any contrary, like anybody that comes in and says anything negative that is somebody that's known or somebody whose account that I can go to and see their business. I would say probably 80 to 90% of the time, it's somebody where if I click on their profile, it goes nowhere. It's like, it's a nothing account with, like, you know, like, it's like, you could be a bot for all I know. Right. So clearly they're not trying to drive traffic to that. And a lot of times those are like, you know, people make, like, you know, multiple accounts and do all that wonderful stuff now or whatever. Right. So people that have a lot of extra time, but I just think that right now, people are intellectually bored in the world right now. And I think social media is a great outlet for all that. And it doesn't seem to be, very productive, which is why, man, having more people producing good content so that people have a better outlet to use that energy, I think is awesome. But I think a lot of people, they just come and they just spew their negative. And that's a problem with the teams and the camps too, right? Is that you should be able to go to somebody that disagrees with your person, that you idolize or follow or whatever, right? And instead of like, you should go there out of curiosity and not go there and be like, hey, I'm going to now, crap talk this other person. Like, look, I'll tell you this, and I'll tell you this on behalf of the majority of the experts in this field. If I want to say something I disagree about with somebody else, then I will say it on my own. You guys don't need to say it on my behalf, right?
Yeah. So. I think when it comes to sort of like the camps from the use of social media during these last couple of years, which has obviously been hard for everybody, I think you tend to see big challenges globally or personally tend to highlight someone's true personality. For every person that I've seen that comes like that, and it says a lot about them, there's another person that uses social media that's benefited them over the time of lockdown. Like, I started this podcast during this pandemic. I have reached out and made connections with people that, people that I've known for a few years, to some extent like yourself, and I've reached out and connected with more. I've made new friends on social media I've never met in person in my whole entire life. And I think you can really make something of the social media thing to really benefit your career. But so many people, it's something inside them. I always talk about going to this event called the Waking Up Weekend, which is a phenomenal event. It's one of the early things that set Tony Robbins up for what he did. And they had this lunchtime drill where at lunchtime you had to go. You had 2 minutes to go up to someone you didn't want to have lunch with and say, I want to have lunch with you. And at lunch, you had to tell them why you didn't want to have lunch with them. And I remember like sitting there going, I won't get that many. It was me and this one guy that sat smoking weed on the breaks thinking aliens were coming to abduct him, and me were the two most popular people. I was like, what did I do? And you look at it and you speak to these people and you realize that, I was relatively in shape at the time, so I was prepping for a shoot. I'm loud by nature. I appear more confident maybe than I am. And it shows you how people's judgments of you is often a reflection of what's going inward, nothing about what you're doing outward. And social media, I suppose that's multiplied by the fact that they can sort of hide in the shadows. And, as you said, it becomes these almost bots kind of people.
Yeah, I think, we just have to accept that, the social media and the internet has made a lot of things easier for us. Like, it's easier to reach out to somebody. It's easier to communicate to a large group of people or whatnot, right? But anytime we knock down barriers that expand our ability to do something, that often comes with then an increased responsibility, right? And I think that's a big thing is that, like, okay, people now speak as if there's no consequences for how they interact with somebody, but they would never interact that way in person. Right. There's no gym in the world where, people walk up to other people in the gym and talk like they do in social media comments. Right.
Yes.
I dabble in a little psychology stuff or whatever, because it interests me, whatnot. I've never been like a person with big social skills. So the more I can nerd out about it, like, in terms of like analyzing it, the better. But that whole idea of anonymity and the way that impacts people from a psychological standpoint, right? That really tells you a lot about who those people are. So it's like, how do they act? It's like that whole, like, how would you act when nobody's looking? Would you still work hard or whatever, right? And it's so the people that would behave poorly if they knew they could get away with it, like, that's essentially what social media just creates such an environment for that to flourish. And unfortunately, with algorithms and all that other stuff, right? Like, we got to the point, I think, and maybe things are changing a little bit, where it's like that type of content, like flourishes, right? Like, people are more attracted to things that produce fear or offense or whatnot, and they're drawn to that. So they're like, if I post something controversial, people are way more likely to engage with that. Like, I will get more comments and way more engagement than if I post something that is very educational, very thought out, very what I would consider like extremely valuable content, like you should have paid for this,
Yeah.
I will get much less engagement than if I post something super simple, but it's a little controversial, right?
Yeah.
And especially if that controversy can be linked to another person, right?
100%.
And it's not an accident that people, start going towards that because, they realize like I can actually grow my following and my engagement, and I can actually get the people that follow me to be like almost like a little army of me or whatever by continuing to feed them this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So who knows? Maybe that's why Instagram doesn't give me much engagement, because I don't produce enough of that content.
Yeah. But it's really interesting. You talk about the why people respond when no one's looking. Like, are you familiar with Devin Brown, the magician? The mentalist magician. So he's
okay, not by his name, but I know who the mentalist is. Yes.
Yeah. So he did a show in the UK a while back where he had this social experiment where he had these people in the audience and they were watching this guy run his life, and basically had hired all these actors that certain things would happen to them and they would vote what the response was. So like, girl walks past, she will either come down and have a drink with him, or she'll accuse him of eyeing her up, and they get into an argument. And it progressed and progressed and progressed. And he got all the audience to put on these white masks. And they progressed and progressed and progressed. They were doing terrible things to this guy. And the social experiment wasn't on him. The social experiment was on the audience. And like, where would they go when they're in a crowd and they're faceless and they can hide behind, not knowing who this guy is? And it was quite shocking of what people would do. And they say social media is maybe a less extreme but larger scale version of this sort of thing. You can be whoever you want. I
think the platforms where people are more anonymous, you see the worst behavior. Like I think like YouTube and Reddit, there's way more trolls on there than there are on Instagram, because most people, their Instagram profile is a link back to them.
Yes.
Right. So, and I think that's why you see like right now, I have seen more, we'll say like fake type profiles than I've ever seen. Like I would say probably in the last, 6 months more than I've seen the entire rest of the time that we've been doing stuff on social media. Like it's like, cause I just scroll through occasionally. Like I see a new follower, it's like whatever. And I just kind of scroll through and I'm just kind of looking at the icons or whatever. And the number of people that are just like no picture and like weird name and numbers or whatever. Yeah. It's like, yeah. So why are all of a sudden there's so many of those? I remember seeing like none of those, and now it's like, man, we got to just start going through and removing these or something, because like, it's not good.
So to finish up and moving into training for the last part of this, earlier on you mentioned about you have been doing work with EMG studies and basically testing out your confirmation biases, eliminating them, which is in a way a relatively brave thing to do, because it is you've built this brand upon this really scientific approach to training, and you could have proven that you were completely right in all these things or completely wrong in all these things. Now, was there anything in those EMG results that surprised you? Was there anything that didn't work how you thought it was going to work? What were the more surprising stuff you found?
I wouldn't say, so basically the process we have is like this, is that we do biomechanical modeling to try and predict what these exercises would be like based off of the mechanics, right? And we've done enough stuff to learn, okay, how is the nervous system going to react in this situation, whatever it was. It's pretty predictive. And then we do the EMG testing after that. So the majority of the time, things line up pretty well. But occasionally when the mechanical modeling, it can be really complex because, it's like, okay, we got multiple joints, here, and there's lots of synergists and stuff. Then it's like these subtle differences of like, okay, a little rotation here, whatnot, like the pecs was a big one for us to change. And I kind of like hit my head, like, after we did it, I'm like, I've been teaching the lats this way forever. Why the hell did it take me so long to switch over and start using the same logic for the pecs in terms of them going like around the rib cage type motion? Okay. And so what really is like, all right, the idea, which I don't know how well people can see me or if they listen to this, but basically if you take your arm in closer to your side and drive your elbow back, right? And you're trying to figure out, well, how much does that stretch my pec versus if I reach my arm, like, back this way or this way. Right. And because it doesn't seem like much. Like it seems like, oh, I could stretch my pec, kind of reaching back this way, or I could stretch it reaching this way, or I could, kind of stretch it like some people might even feel like that this isn't the one that is more of a stretch than this or that or whatever because of the fascia and the pec minor underneath that they're feeling, et cetera, whatever. And so that was one where, working that one out took a little bit of time because it's like, all right, where exactly in there do we need to be? And like, exactly how do we need to get this position to be the absolute best stretch on the pecs, right? And then the same thing, because it's like, as you bring the shoulder across, well, it's like, well, how much protraction do we need, right? Like, I know we're taking, origin to insertion here, but it's like, how much of that protraction and rotation needs to occur and when does it need to occur? Because one of the things that happens when we're trying to work out, like, okay, this is the specific place we want to go for the clavicular fibers of the pec, right? Is that if you just blindly try and go there, if you have your arm a little too in, out, a little too rotated or whatever, you won't get to that spot, right? Like, so that is something that, was taken a little bit of time to work out all of those variables, right?
Is that exercise dependent? Is that more load dependent than exercise dependent as well, right? Because I suppose like putting aside line of force and resistant profiles and all that will obviously change things. Like one of your big things in regards to the pecs was obviously not keeping your shoulder blades depressed too much and locked in place when you're doing pressing exercises. Mm-hmm. Would that change from certain, like obviously if you getting to a bench press or whatever dumbbell press where it gets very, very heavy, is there going to be more of an argument of keeping them more locked in from a safety and stability standpoint and then allowing them to move on these flies, which would change a little bit of how you look at this in terms of a program? If that makes sense.
So the glenohumeral rhythm changes a little bit with loading, right?
Yeah.
But very small, very small.
Okay.
So you look at, and I did a video of I think the guy's name is Kirill or whatever. It was like it was a record setting bench press, right? And he protracts during the bench press, right? And he protracts pretty much the same amount that he should protract during his lighter set of the bench press. And I think that's something that gets lost on people, is just that, like, it's thinking like, oh, well, because it's here and I'm going to do it now. It really just comes with like, well, what is the end destination of that? Like, because his hands are out wide or whatever, right? So it's just, he's not coming around as much. So there's going to be relatively less of the protraction, but you're not going to have a more stable shoulder if you come across more, but you're back more, right? It's about being in the right position of both joints relative to each other and relative to the load. So there'd be a difference between doing a fly where the load would be pushing straight out with like a cable versus having some load that was pressing sagittally back into you, right? And so your scapula is trying to figure out, hey, what is the most stable place for me to be? Which is why our solution is like, look, if you focus on exactly what you need to do with the humerus, your nervous system is unconsciously going to regulate that scapula better than you can consciously decide, right? Like if you restrict, you excessively, if you do anything where you're like consciously manipulating the scapula, you are deciding that you know better than all of the years of evolution and all of the years of adaptation since you've been alive how to organize those two joints together. So you better be damn sure that you're doing it better than your nervous system. And it's always never the case. It's almost always the case that if you teach people how to move the humerus properly, that the scapular rhythm will get better just by actually doing that. It's just that we tend to train, like, there just seems to be this huge gap between like very nuanced training that's like very biomechanically proficient. And then people that are just like, oh, like none of that stuff matters, or like this exercise does this or whatever. Right. And in reality, it's like we can be very nuanced with biomechanics, but we can also understand that like, hey, if you just go under a load, your body's just going to do this thing that it does. And we can look at what happens and then we can say, well, is that good? Is that bad? Or whatever. Right. It's not just like, just be thoughtless about it because you don't have control over it. It's like, no, be thoughtful about it because you can still make a programming decision on it without having to be like, oh, I'm not going to put 16 cues in this for a client, but I know if I put them in this environment, this is the likely outcome, rather than just thinking like, oh, it just doesn't matter, just choose any chest exercise or whatever. There's a huge gap right now between like the people that really understand biomechanics and a lot of people that understand a little bit. And I don't know how this is going to go, but right now I would say like I'm to the point where I'm thinking about removing the word biomechanics from our course, because it's just the amount of stuff out there that's just being taught at an embarrassing level. And I think that's just a lot of people just like they learn a little bit and they jump in too soon. And I would say I'm absolutely guilty of making the majority of those mistakes also earlier in my career. And it wasn't until we really kind of started moving away from the foundational information and actually looking back like, okay, we need to go back. We need to learn anatomy better. Because even though like I took, cadaver lab in university or whatever, it's like that really wasn't as nuanced as I need it to be talking about exercise to this level. Right. And I think that's where, some of the other people in your circle or whatever that, maybe we've taken a different approach is like, we've went back and we've like, okay, there's a deeper level to this anatomy stuff. And it's really hard to find resources on it. Like for instance, we're looking at, how some muscles share common origins through connective tissue and whatnot. And it's like, okay, maybe I can find 3 references on this on Earth, right? And maybe one of those is like from an original Grey's Anatomy text that's like, it's decades old, right? And it's like, so maybe I get like this like black and white drawing sketch or whatever. And it's like, okay, so I have to take that and then somehow bring it to, 2021 level.
But those things have a massive impact, right? Like I, the one that springs to mind there is the psoas having a fascial attachment to the diaphragm, which will then completely change where, okay, how does my breathing mechanics affect my hip and vice versa? That you wouldn't make that, if you looked at just a basic anatomy textbook of origins and insertions, you wouldn't link the two. But when you start to take that nuance, you go, oh, okay, my ribcage position has a massive impact on the stability of my hip and vice versa. And I think you're right in the sense of the biomechanics. Like I struggle to use that word now for that exact reason. It's that, where's that line between what is sort of like optimal and practical in it? Like I remember when I first started, I'm not a naturally built squatter. I've got big, long femurs, short tib fib. And if I'm looking to build my quads, back squat's never going to be my preferred exercise of choice. But when I first started getting looked at from people who had RTS, and this is not a knock on Tom Purvis or Mark Goulden or anyone else, these guys can apply it well, but it's the people that are a few rungs down learning from him were like, you're not built to it, don't do it, do pendulum squat instead, which is fine. But at what point then do you go, well, he's never practicing the skill of the squat. Is there a way of progressing him to some form of squatting pattern, whether that's massively heels elevated, much wider stance, whatever else? And what I found over years is like, yeah, I've got good quads. I moved considerably worse. And it's to some extent, if that's entirely what I wanted and just wanted to be as jacked as possible, I don't care if I can sit down in the toilet without shifting shapes, then fine. But most clients you're going to get are going to be somewhere in the middle. They're going to, they can do 12 weeks of truly hypertrophy, but eventually kind of want something more to their training. And that's what keeps their enjoyment. So when it comes to like you looking at the application of mechanics, like where's that line that you draw between working around structural issues and looking to improve on what can be improved? Big question, I know.
Yeah. All right. So condense that into, less than 5 hours, right? I would say, what we're looking at, because the way we approach things from the stimulus perspective is that tends to work a lot of that out, because I might choose a different exercise, during a neuro phase versus a hypertrophy phase versus a metabolic phase. So I would say, if I had to summarize what we do, it's really, we just look like, it's like, what's the best option we have for the particular goals, right? And then just go for that. But then we change the goal, we move the goals more often than most people do, which means then there will be time that we're able to bring in those other exercises or whatever, because there will be phases where it's like, look, I don't need to hit the absolute length and position of the quads this time. So this is a good time to use a different exercise, for that or whatever. Or it's like, actually, this is a systemic place. Like, cool. Yeah, sure. Maybe you couldn't get quads, in a squat like a pendulum squat, but I bet if we put you in some sort of squat pattern, you can get a much better systemic output than you could in just the pendulum squat, right? Yeah. So especially if we talk about the ratio of systemic demand to muscular fatigue, which is what we're trying to achieve there, right? In order for you to get systemic demand in a pendulum squat, you basically have to murder your quads, right? But I might be able to put you in a heel elevated trap bar or a squat or whatever and be like, okay, cool. So now we can do this. It'll be systemically demanding, but your quads won't be shot. So that means we can do it again in 2 days or 3 days or whatever, which is exactly what we're going for. But if I murder somebody on a very quad bias, like perfectly designed machine, well, maybe we're not hitting that again for 5-6 days.
Yeah. And is that how you come about going into progression and exercise as well? Because the more I learn in this industry, I don't really like the term progression because I just find exercises, they're different. They're not a progression, they're not a regression. They're different for the stimulus involved. So is that a similar thing where your exercise selection evolves with the stimulus that's evolves, rather than looking at, let's say, front elevated, flat, rear elevated, split squat, where that's the one I couldn't get my head around, because everyone's going, you do front elevated first. Charles is a very firm believer in that. I'm like, but no, because in one example, that could be more hip flexion, a greater range of motion and more challenge. And for someone else, depending on how high the foot is, it's a regression. It's not, it's different. So is it the same thing?
No, we don't use a progression regression model. We look at how closely does this exercise achieve the goal we want, right? And that's looking at, okay, what's range of motion does it we take it in, right? How specific is it to the target tissue? Is it very specific? Is it kind of specific, right? How much of that range of motion, where in the range of motion, what's the resistance curve, profile of that, I would say the closest thing would be is that, like, is there a skill component to that lift?
Yes.
Like that affects the loadability for that client, right? So it's just like, okay, this exercise here, because it requires this degree of technique, means we can't use it for these stimuluses right now because we can't train it to that degree of muscular fatigue, right? Like technique will give out, or a stabilizer or some other muscle or whatever will give out, or whatnot. It'll just be too much of a technical challenge for the goal, right? But I still wouldn't consider that as progressions and regressions of the exercise. It's just, that's actually on the client's aspect of like, hey, this is where you are. These are the exercises that just happen to fit you right now that you're most capable of, right? But it's like, that doesn't mean that when you switch to that other version, that makes that other version necessarily better. It might be no better. It's just like, okay, now you could get that stimulus in a more complex way, but we might be able to get the same or better stimulus in an exercise that's just simple. So really it comes down to a logistical decision of like, hey, if I don't have a lot of options and I have to choose between giving you something simpler that's not quite as good versus giving you something complex that's a little bit better, then I have to make that judgment call for the client at that time. Right. But if I have all the exercise options in the world and I have the best machines and everything, there's pretty much nothing that I can't do with a client that I can simplify enough for them to, achieve the stimulus that day. Right. Really, it comes down to working with whatever limitations they have.
Yeah. And knowing, again, come back to knowing your anatomy, learning your setup. I think that there's one thing that I knew already, but I certainly took away from you, the in-person course that we did. It's like how much easier coaching becomes when setup is nailed down. If you can get someone set up right, you can coach. I find it very rare now that I struggle to coach someone on anything. And all I've done is got better at my setup of exercises, where it's easier to do it right than do it wrong.
Yeah. That was, I think, probably the biggest improvement both for us and all of our students as well, because if you followed us back in the MI40 days, we used a shitload of cues, right? Like we were trying to problem solve with cues, and then it hit me as like, this is not the right way to go about it, right? Is because there would be people that just get it and they weren't intellectually smarter, and it's like, and that's what allowed them to do a row better. It's just like, whatever. It's like, oh, it fit them better. But like, okay, what does fit them better? Oh, that means that their body was positioned better for this. So why don't we just position everybody's body in the best way possible? And then maybe they don't have to, have this, mental gymnastics that they're going through to try and get the exercise right. And I know a lot of trainers love cues, like to the point where they just keep saying them even when the clients don't need them. And that drives me nuts more than anything. Right. Like, it's just like, like at any time I see that at a course or whatever, I'll be like, hey, if they don't need the cue, don't say the cue, because the only thing you can do at this point, because if they're already doing it, the only thing that providing that instruction can do is possibly make it worse.
Yeah, doubling up.
The only possible outcome. Yes, right.
Yeah,
you know?
I see that's an overcueing. That overcueing and over spotting are the two things. Like I hate it when someone's literally holding onto someone's wrist or their elbows to a whole set of dumbbell press. I'm just like, just let them do it. Just step back for a second. You'll know before they fall to bits when to step back in. Allow them to learn the pattern without you being over their shoulder all the time.
Yeah. I think that's, if there's one thing that people take away, from our introductory stuff is this, yes, like just switch all of your mental effort into setting up your clients right. I mean, the sessions they're just so much more enjoyable, right? To like on both parties, right? Because one of the things that I try and tell people is like, look, when you're constantly giving your client instruction, you don't know what the psychological impact of that is going to be all the time, right? Because like, imagine that you were doing something and there was just somebody walking around barking at you, telling you how to do it, right? Like a literal, backseat driver for your life, right? Like that would make you feel really crappy. And eventually you just want to just like kick that person out. Yeah. And so in the gym, it's no different. It's like your client wants to feel like they're doing a good job. And that's a lot more of a challenge if you're just saying the same things to them all the time. They don't know if they're doing any better or any worse or whatnot. And the fact that you're constantly having to instruct them keeps them in the state of always thinking that, man, I can't do this right without you like constantly, ragging and telling me, how to do it or whatnot. Right. But it's like, hey, if you get people set up right, and then they just do it on their own, and then the only thing you have to do is provide encouragement and effort and maybe tighten up the technique as fatigue comes, that's a lot more gratifying experience on the client's end, right? They will walk out of that session feeling much better about themselves, right? Yeah. I think with trainers sometimes it's like they might feel like the way they need to deliver value is that they need to be overly involved in the experience. And like, no, you set the client up for a successful session, right? And then you guide them through that, right? But your goal is not to take the workout over for them. Otherwise, just grab the dumbbells yourself and do the reps, man.
Yeah, like couldn't agree more. So, like, just to sort of like task things, I know I've taken up a lot of your time, and this is your evening for your chance to wind down and not be always on. So before we go into where to find you, recently you launched the biometric coaching course, which is the newer offering from your on your site. Tell us a little bit about that, why that came about, and who is it for?
So actually, that's the first third-party coach or educator that we have on there. That's Dustin Nelson, who is a longtime friend and mentor that I've learned from as well from way back in the Poliquin days and whatnot. And Dustin has a tremendous background in traditional Chinese medicine and, basically that whole Eastern medicine field. And he spent the last, I don't know how many years, basically trying to figure out how to translate that, for all of us, pale Western people, right, that have had a totally different approach. And one of the things that I always liked about that, right, because, reading a little bit into the Chinese medicine stuff when I was younger is it's very practical stuff, right? And so it's not necessarily you trying to become a doctor per se, but it's like, hey, these are things as a coach, as a trainer, that you could assess and evaluate and provide an intervention with, and then be able to subsequently reevaluate that. And they tend to be very low risk, right? Type interventions or whatnot. And so the whole purpose of the biometric course was can we add, can we add things that are in the wheelhouse of a coach that could improve their ability to figure out, well, what stimulus does this person need? How well are they recovering? When do they need to, switch training phases, right? Are there other metrics that I can use, like the ability to add something in as simple as looking at somebody's tongue, right? It's like, okay, what, and trying to say like, okay, can we learn a little bit about how somebody is experiencing stress and inflammation and whatnot, from something as simple as like, okay, looking at a tongue, right? That's no different than, looking at somebody's squat form or whatever. And you're like, okay, it looks like you're doing this. Let's move your feet this way and see what happens. Right. And it's like, this is almost like, I look at this as almost a tool set where it's like, okay, it looks like this. Let's try this, lifestyle intervention, or let's try this supplement, or let's try this change in your nutrition or your training, and see what happens, and see if that doesn't add, we'll say, more tangible data to the assessment that are within the tools of a coach, right? So it gives us a little, it gives us better ways of thinking about things like HRV and stuff like that. So really, that course is meant to add nuances to your ability to assess clients as a coach without having to try and play doctor. That's exactly where that fits in, right? So it's like, and again, then the interventions also are in that play of like, look, these are things that aren't going to be super objectionable to your client, right? To be able to try out. I think that's the best way that I could describe that, without doing any injustice to like the complexity of it.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I think, and again, it comes back down to what is the lowest barrier for entry for a client to be able to actually take some of this stuff and make it work. And I think that's a fascinating approach. Certainly immersing myself in that part of the world, there's so much stuff here in the medicine realm that I don't understand or I haven't explored. And I think it's a fascinating realm of how much of the modern westernized medicine that we have now has come, albeit far too late, from this part of the world. And I think there's so much that could be uncovered here. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. And Dustin does a very good job of providing as much translation in there, because like, people look at things like, oh, what is spleen chi? And like, they're just like, what the hell is that? Cause it's like the way that, they will talk about things in Chinese medicine is very different. And that it's more of a, we'll say because when they say kidney, they don't literally mean kidney. Right. And when they say spleen, they don't literally mean spleen, like we do. It's just like these are translations to us, but they refer to more systems than they do organs. Right. So like if somebody has like, so kidneys is going to be like a combination of like cellular energy production and adrenal health. And like, it's that whole system. It's not your literal kidney. So it's this more like big picture scope view, which I like. And then the ability to translate that into like, well, the herbs that they used back then, these are the things that we have that work mechanistically similar to those herbs, right? Because it's like, oh, they use this, right? But what we know now is that increases glutathione, or whatever it may be. And it's like, oh, okay. So it makes for, I know like a ton of people in the evidence-based community that like anytime it comes to anything Eastern medicine related, whether it be herbology, whether it be, acupuncture or whatever, like they're just like, oh, boo that, and they'll be like, oh, there's no research on that. And there's actually like, thousands and thousands of studies on it, ironically. Right. But it's like, no, there's just nothing that you're reading now or whatever. But also there's, that's not one of those things where it's just like, yeah, you do this thing and it turns you into Superman. Like, no, but if you take that stuff into context, like I have used this stuff as a coach extremely successfully throughout my career, but I'm in no position to teach it. Yeah. And so that's where we're really fortunate to have Dustin come on and do it. Right. Cause I learned enough that I was able to utilize some of those tools very successfully in my coaching career. Right. Yeah. And like things where it's like, okay, the stuff off the shelf would not work, but I got, a little formula here, whatever, or, I added this thing to my assessment and it's like, oh, that works. I got another thing instead of like, oh, hey, here, just take the adrenal supplement from whatever bodybuilding company that has literally every herb any herb that on examine.com says does something for adrenal, you just put that in there and just take it. Right. Just like, cause that's what the majority of the supplement industry is, right? Is like, okay, it's like, these are all things that are associated with that. We just put it all we just build the ingredient list up as big as possible. Right. And that's kind of the opposite of what they were doing in Chinese medicine, which is like, how do we get the right herbs in the right combination that seem to have a benefit? And now that we can kind of translate that a little bit more, you can even if you don't use like any of those formulas, you understand what you would actually be looking for in either single ingredients or traditional supplements, right?
I think that's something that also it's almost been lost after the death of Charles Poliquin in the sense of his biosec. And a lot of people will go, it's a lot of people just selling a lot of supplements, and a lot of these things are just sorted out by training and diet alone. And while that to a degree may be very much true, I witnessed the era where people were literally living and breathing that sort of stuff. And I saw people use higher doses of certain things, have tremendous results in certain areas, on whether it's just on the sites they use or clients' health or recovery. And I think, like everything, I think I say this phrase in every podcast, but like the answer falls somewhere in the middle. Like, do you need a supplement list as long as you are on day one because your umbilical readings are over 20? Of course not. But it doesn't mean that some of the things that were taught in there are incredibly useful if you know the right dosages and the right person to use it with. Absolutely. And especially when it comes to things like stress and recovery and things like HRV, there's massive scope to improve someone's recovery with the right things.
Yeah. I think probably what was lost in that, and this is a big thing. If you're listening to this and you're somebody that really likes or really falls on the side of, being very evidence-based, which I don't even like that term evidence-based, because it seems to be just like specific research bias-based is what it really is. It's not all, because it's not all evidence, which is what you actually need to look at. But it's just that when we look at research and when we look at stuff that's being done in a controlled environment versus what is being done in, actual practice, and people that have flexibility in their lives, where it's just like they're not in the metabolic ward, or they're going to go off their diet or whatever, like the way they feel and experience the diet and the training matters. That's where I think a lot of things that kind of got poo-pooed on in terms of like, well, if this person is like stuck to this rigid lifestyle and this diet and this training, they have no choice because it's in a research setting. They have to go through with it. They can get just as good a result as the person that doesn't do it. That's one thing. But then understanding like, hey, if you give people a few things that make the experience better, whether that's they feel like they perform better, they sleep, like just like all of these like small intangible compounding variables where it's like, hey, I know there's plenty of instances where it's like, look, this doesn't boost their metabolism. It's not a fat burner, whatever. But it's like, I know that these things here are going to enhance their experience and actually make it easier for them to comply and achieve the calorie deficit and the workouts and whatever. So it's like, those are the things that you lose if you're being overly strict on how you're evaluating the data and then just applying that as if every person can function in that same context, when it's reality. It's like, look, there's a lot of things that we have to do in the real world to be successful that won't show up on a lab because the lab removes those conditions.
Yeah, exactly. And it comes back to that thing of nuance as well, right? A lot of people that are appeal to the evidence-based camp, it's almost they don't understand the deeper side of working of it, so they'd rather fall on the level of simplicity. Now, while most clients might fall on the basics, a few simple things that are what the evidence-based people will get 90% of your results, but it doesn't mean that 10% isn't important for the right person. And it just takes a lot more work and a lot more understanding to be able to know what is useful, what is not, and what is not useful for your clientele, like you said earlier. So
it's much easier to dismiss an idea than to take on the effort to understand it.
Exactly. So so for people who want to learn more about you, who want to learn more about N1 and training, before I ask a couple of more silly closing questions, where can people find you and your courses and everything else like that?
So our courses are on n1.education. But if you want to just kind of see what we're about, there is a preview course on there that you can do. Then I can't remember how many, it's like 6 hours worth of content or whatever that you could just, look at for free. But we're on YouTube, just put in N1 education. We're on Instagram. We have 3 accounts on there. My Coach Kassem account, N1 education, N1 training. And then hopefully we will be launching an app here in January of 2022, which will kind of be taking everything and putting it in one spot. But, we appreciate support whenever you guys want to provide it. We do probably put out as much, if not more, content than almost anybody in terms of like actual education based content. Like if you're looking for, slim clothing and, big butt cheeks and just like stuff like that, product placed, jar of BCAAs, you're not going to find any of that on our stuff. But, if you're just looking at, very simple exercise comparisons, tips and tricks and stuff like that, highlights from our courses, then you'll find tons of that.
Yeah, I gotta say, I said this at the start of the podcast, and I'll say it again. I can totally vouch for the amount of content, and I appreciate that I was a beta tester, so I've seen this develop over the years. But the amount of content on your courses is unbelievable. Like you really do have it's worth going through from like a book from page 1 to page end. But one of the most things I've found with your course, because there's so much content, going back in, and if I'm ever struggling with a program, I can go back into a certain module and we go, okay, that makes sense. There's always something there. So if there's a coach watching this, I 100% vouch for Kass's courses. They're absolutely phenomenal. And the what you guys do and the team do is absolutely like top notch. So going on to a little bit of like a couple of sillier questions just to end off. So recently, you put up a post sharing people that you would support in the industry, and this listed. And then when you swiped, there was like you mentioned like the list of people that you wouldn't, plus the people that if you wouldn't invite, wouldn't go out with for pizza. And I just remember I had this flashback of our practical course where I literally did just that. And I asked you, do you want to go for pizza? So I kind of just wanted a silly question of what is your favorite fast food restaurant? If pizza isn't your thing, what is your thing?
Okay. Well, one, that wasn't exactly the post, but I'll answer the question anyway. I mean, honestly, I've never been a big like fast food person. I would say right now, the thing that I do probably go to more in that realm would be wings. We have a franchise here in the States. It's called Buffalo Wild Wings. It's not the best, but it's, in terms of fast food, it's pretty decent. But I actually do like pizza quite a bit. So the second part of that post was actually like, here's the list of people that I agree with 100%. And there's nobody listed. And at the bottom, it said, and anybody that suggests we get pizza. So basically, I will agree with anybody that suggests we get pizza.
Okay.
I guess, except you. I guess that was maybe.
So just
that wasn't a time where Nick was we were going through all of those gyms or whatever, and that super huge heat wave was coming through, and our Airbnb had no AC or whatever. So it's like that might have been one of the very few times in the world. It's like, no. It's like, I've been sweating for 16 hours. I don't want pizza right now. Like,
it's a hot gym.
Give me a cold bath and a sushi. Yes.
Yeah, a hot old basement. So just to close off, what is it that you are most grateful for at this moment in time? It can be a couple of things.
Well, since we've just opened the HQ, I would say one of the things I'm most grateful for is the ability to have been involved in the development of equipment. Because I mean, my gym is full of things that I have, at least in part, designed and innovated myself. And when I first embarked on this journey, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to get the best equipment. But now it's like, that was just the best equipment that was available. Right. And you quickly learn that even with the best things, it could always be better. And now it's like, I have so many things where it's like, this is exactly or as close to exactly as I would want it as possible. My only thing I wish is like, I wish I would have had this 10 years ago when I was really like training, like for physique goals, where it's like, now I have it where I'm training to not be so fat, and for mostly research, but, so that's something I'm hugely grateful for. And I would say the other thing is just I mean, really just the amount of support and feedback that we've gotten from our students. Because I mean, that is the why for why, like, I have the intellectual interest that I could delete all of my stuff, close the business, and I would go in a cabin and I would still nerd out on these things by myself and be fulfilled by that. Like, like just like, yep, I just want to do this. Like, I just enjoy playing with this stuff or whatever. What really drives me to want to do any of this stuff from the business is the feedback and the experiences that we hear from our coaches. Like, I mean, a lot of our coaches now, and over the last few years, the number of coaches that we've had that are getting so successful, like, and so much earlier in their careers, like having this knowledge earlier. That's something where it's just like, in terms of leaving a legacy or making a difference, like, that is the best evidence that we have, right? I mean, we have more coaches that are training higher profile figures right now than I did in my career, like as a whole, like, and it's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy to see. And the feedback that we get and the degree of change that it's making in people's careers and lives is like that's huge. Like, I started this selfishly because I enjoy it. And then all of a sudden now it's like, now I want to keep investing in this other part because now I have this other reason to really want to do that. Right. And that's not me claiming to somehow be the only altruist in the world or whatever, because obviously I enjoy it. Like, that makes me feel good about myself or whatever. Right. So, because people be like, oh, so you think you're just being altruistic? It's like, no, I completely understand that I like these other people being successful makes me happy. And that's why I want them to be successful. Yeah. But,
that's such a good answer. And I think it's those things of, like, when you look back, it's like, I can imagine what it's like being a proud parent of, like, seeing your child do things that you couldn't do or you didn't have the ability to do. It's the same thing now. You've got a whole load of coaches that are now successful, massively successful. And on the equipment side of things, it's probably the fitness industry equivalent of having your own action figure. Is being able to have a hat that you can literally say, I made that better. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And whenever Hong Kong opens up, which is probably sometime in the next decade, we're allowed to actually travel anywhere without quarantine, I'll definitely have to come and see this HQ, because congratulations, it looks unbelievable.
So awesome. Thank you. We'll be glad to have you. And we will get pizza.
Yes. All right, deal. I'm going to hold you to that. Right, man, thank you so much for today. It's been a really, really, really good chat. Thank you very much for coming on.
All right. Thank you, Simon.